This video is going to go into detail on all of the various causes of the Great Depression. There are a few key terms that you need to know, but keep in mind the overall objective. By the end of the video, you should be able to describe the variety of causes that contributed to the Great Depression. Here are a few questions that I want you to think about. The first one is, how did the actions of individuals contribute to the crisis in the 30s, and what could people have done differently to avoid the Great Depression? In the last video, you learned about the stock market crash, and the crash had a domino effect on just about everyone in America and even people abroad. Even people who didn't have money invested in the stock market were affected by the crash. So this chart kind of explains how various groups of people, various industries, etc. were affected by the crash. So those that were immediately affected would be the investors. So if you invest in the stock market, you could have lost millions of dollars. Businesses therefore are losing profits because they're not going to have people investing in their company. Businesses lose profits, they have to cut down on production, they close their doors, they have to lay off workers. People also aren't spending as much money. If you lost money in the stock market, you really don't have a lot of money to spend. You're probably filled up your credit and using your credit for necessities. So a lot of businesses failed. So you could have been laid off from your job. Even if you didn't have money in the stock market, your business could have closed its doors and you're unemployed. So now you're going to end up struggling. One of the biggest factors, and something that really scared people back in the 30s, were these things called bank runs. So people would go to banks, they would stay there overnight waiting to get in to get their money. The problem was that the banks didn't have enough money to cover all of the accounts. So today your money is backed up by the FDIC. So they're guaranteed to have up to $200,000 of your money. If they don't have it, the government's going to make sure you can get it, the actual cash. Back then, your money wasn't protected by any sort of government organization. There was no laws that said your money had to be there. So people went to the bank and they simply did not have the money and they had to close their doors. People waited for them to reopen and they never did. So you could have lost your entire life savings simply because the bank ran out of money and you weren't the first person to get there. The banks had tried to call in loans that they had given out to people, but if you lost money in the stock market or if your business closed its doors, you couldn't repay the loans. So there's really no money in circulation here, and people are starting to really panic when they don't have access to their money in a bank anymore. The banks are completely unreliable. Now, if you remember when we learned about World War I, we talked about the war reparations that Germany had to pay, right? $33 billion. The United States had invested in the German economy, and the Germans were using that money to pay Britain and France. Britain and France were using that money to buy American goods, to pay us back. So when we can no longer invest in a foreign economy, especially Germany, and Germany therefore cannot pay back loans to the Allies, and the Allies can't pay us, it has this ripple effect where trade virtually stops. There's no money being invested overseas, nobody's investing money in the US, so we can't even tap into our international resources. So the crisis is not just an American crisis, it's a crisis overseas, right? Germany is already in a depression after World War I, and the situation gets so much worse since we're connected in this global economy. While the crash sparked the Great Depression, it was not the only cause. So one of the factors that was missing from that chart, because it's not related directly to the stock market, is what was going on in the Midwest, and that was the Dust Bowl. So prior to the crash, farmers in America were experiencing their own economic depression. So farmers had taken out loans during World War I to buy very expensive farm equipment because there's a high demand for food for the troops. But after the war was over, the demand for agriculture decreased suddenly, and farmers really had no means of making any money. They couldn't afford to pay back their loans, and they began to suffer. And to make matters worse, there was a huge dust storm that was due to overcultivation of the land. So the land got very dry, and there was a drought, and it was literally just flying into the air, as you can see in these pictures. It's dark clouds of black dust and dirt, forcing people to have to leave their homes. The land was virtually destroyed. So a lot of people had to head out west, and this map shows exactly where the Dust Bowl, the area was, and just how widespread this environmental disaster was. So these people are suffering during the Depression for other reasons besides just the economy, to have this natural kind of disaster taking place. So many Americans were experiencing financial troubles that was kind of growing as the decade went on, right? Everything seemed very prosperous, but if you really looked under the surface, it was not so great. So the 20s is known as this period of economic prosperity, but not everybody's getting rich, right? Remember, people are buying things on credit, so they appear that they're doing very well, but in actuality, they don't really have a lot of assets. They don't have a lot of cash. The gap between the rich and the poor was large, just like we saw in the industrial era, and only the rich are actually getting richer. Most Americans were living at or below the minimum standard of living, which at that time was about $2,500 per year. And you can see from this pie chart that 65% of people are making less than $2,000 a year. To make matters worse, 80% of Americans had absolutely no savings account. These individuals had their money invested in the stock market, or they had that get-rich-quick attitude. A savings account takes time. They want to get rich quick, so their money's in the stock market, so they don't have money in the bank. So even though many Americans aren't making a lot of money, the economy appeared to be very prosperous, and it was thriving, but it was thriving due to credit. People had clothes, they had the car, they had the house, they had all these luxuries of modern living, but it was all bought on credit. And personal debt was increasing throughout the decade, while the actual cash that people had in the bank was minimal, if they had any at all. So the combination of high debt and low funds was definitely a recipe for disaster. The 1920s is also the start of the consumer economy that we very intricately associate with capitalism. Okay, it's an economy that thrives off of consumer spending. The more we spend, the better the economy does, and the converse, therefore, is also true. Okay, so as the decade progressed, spending began to decline. People had already purchased these durable goods. These are goods that you don't need to buy often, like a radio, car, furniture. Once you buy it, it takes years before you would need to buy something else. But the factories were continuing to produce these products, so the surplus was very high, but the demand was low. So the price of goods dropped, and the economy began to shrink as people slowed down their spending. And if spending drops dramatically, we can find ourselves in a recession. Okay, and if things don't get better, you can actually hit kind of the lowest of the low, which is an economic depression that we saw throughout the decade of the 30s. Okay, so for homework, what I want you to do is go back through your notes, and I want you to explain the 6 causes. Okay, so you have the stock market crash, a decline in spending, business failures, personal financial problems, the Dust Bowl, and bank failure. So just be able to explain how these contributed to the Great Depression. And if you have any questions, just jot them down and we'll go over them in class. Have a good night.